Good morning. My name is Dan O'Connor, and I'm Director of Business Development here at Simulations Plus. And we've just begun the GastroPlus version 9.7 new release webinar, but we'll let a few more minutes elapse just to see attendees that are coming in a minute or two late. So we'll mute for a moment and begin momentarily. Okay, well, again, thank you very much for joining us this morning. Again, my name is Dan O'Connor, Director of Business Development. It's Tuesday, April 23rd, and on behalf of the entire Simulations Plus team, I wish to welcome you to the GastroPlus version 9.7 release webinar. Presenting this morning will be Dr. Viera Lukakova, Director of Simulation Science, and several times during her presentation this morning, we'll extend an invitation to you to respond to questions, a few questions. They'll appear on your screen and we'll allow about 30 seconds for you to respond. We would also invite you to submit any questions that you may have via the question pane on your control panel, or you may use the hand raising icon on the control panel to ask your question directly at the end. There's also a quick survey at the end that we would invite you to respond to. So please be sure to enter your unique audio PIN, which was displayed when you joined the call. This will help us to identify who's asking the question. This call and webinar is being recorded for playback and will be available on our website, www.simulations-plus.com. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Viera Lukakova.
Thank you, Dan, for the nice introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever in the world you are. So today we'll be talking a little bit about the new features that are coming up in the version 9.7. Some of you have already heard some of the features that are coming up, but we'll summarize all the critical ones, so you will see what you will be able to enjoy once you upgrade. Once I figure out how to move the slides. So I'm not going to go through the details on this slide. It's just showing a summary of where we have been making changes, where new features are coming up. And as you can see, just like with most of our versions, we have made modifications or improvements and added new features in different parts of the program. So whether you are working as a formulator or more a DMPK department, looking at PBPK models, drug-drug interactions, or other administration dosage routes, you should find something interesting and useful in this new version. So we'll start on the absorption side, ACAT compartment, with the finally added the extension for being able to define a compound with more than one solubility input. So we've added two different forms of molecule that you can now account for. This could be used to account for scenarios where your formulation maybe contains two different crystalline forms of the compound or crystalline and amorphous form of the compound. And you want to explore how the contribution of the less soluble form of the compound in the formulation might be affecting the exposure, or start looking at scenarios where you are administering one form of the compound and it precipitates in a different form. So the setup is very simple. You will see on the compound tab where you are used to enter your reference solubility, you will have an additional button that brings up a form where you can set up solubility for the second form, either in your formulation or a precipitate of the compound. For 1 always represents your reference solubility from the compound tab. The second form is additional one that you may define. And as you can see at the bottom, you can define or tell the program which form will be actually precipitating if precipitation occurs in the intestine. And because you could have both of these in the formulation and in the percent dose entry, you would define which form is in the formulation or how the combination of these two forms of the compound are contributing to the formulation. You also have an option to define separate particle size for each of these forms. Of course, the particle size will be relevant only for the form which has a non-0% in the dose, so you don't have to worry about filling both if you are only working with single form of the compound, but you have an option to distinguish not only solubilities, but also particle size distributions. And you can define these distributions either as the simple function, normal, log normal distribution, or if you have a user-defined inputs, again, you can have user-defined particle size distribution for each of the forms. Here is a couple of simple examples for the effects. This first one is showing if we have 2 different forms of the molecule with very different solubilities, and we are changing the contribution of the forms in the formulation. So the very first plot is showing entirely administration of the low solubility form. In the middle one, we have a combination of both. And on the right, we have the high solubility form. So you can see the effects on the exposure of the compound in vivo if we're just mixing these 2 forms of the molecule. The second example is looking more at the differences in the precipitation. Again, if we have a scenario where the compound is precipitating in a less soluble form than what was administered, on the left-hand side showing the typical example that you can model now, where the compound precipitates in the same form in which it is being administered. On the right, you see precipitation in the less soluble form, resulting in less redissolution of the precipitate and lower exposure for the compound. The other long discussed and requested feature that we've included in this version is more detailed description of the fat conditions. For those of you who have been using GastroPlus for some time, you know that the fat physiology, we had one sort of standard fat physiology with stomach transit time about 1 hour, and the bile salt concentration in duodenum getting up to about 15 millimoles. But if you wanted to model effects of different meals, let's say looking at the high calorie meal, high fat meal, low calorie meals, you would have to make modifications yourself to the physiology to account for these. So now we have finally incorporated the effects and incorporated different combinations of the fat physiologies or the built-in adjustments to the fat physiology to account for the different types of meals. So now when you select a fat physiology, you will have this additional setting for fat meal options, where the default is still our fat physiology that we had in all the previous versions with the standard 1 hour gastric transit time and just under 15 millimoles bile salt concentration in duodenum. But in that fat state model, you will have a drop down with number of predefined combinations of low, moderate, and high fat and calories in the meal. And as one of the options, we entered specifically FDA breakfast meal, since in the guidance we were able to find specification for the calories and percent fat in that meal. So you can directly select what would be the prediction for the FDA breakfast meal specifically. And you do have an option also define your own calories and percent fat by selecting user defined. If you select user-defined option, the entries for calories and fat meal will be enabled, and you can define what, how many calories, how much fat in the meal it is to start making predictions. Okay. One more modification that we've made is when doing the evaluation and the different fat conditions, we realized that the zero-order gastric emptying really describes the emptying from the stomach in the fat state better than the first order that we are using for fasted condition. So now when you select one of these additional fat state models, the zero-order gastric emptying will be automatically checked. It's still an optional setting. You have an option to uncheck it, but by default, it will be selected. This is information showing combining information from number of papers. It's 12 different papers showing measured number of different gastric emptying times based on the number of calories in the meal. So combining all that information together, we were able to come up with a linear function to estimate the gastric emptying time based on the calories. So that's where it fills in. When you enter your calories in the meal, the gastric emptying time gets automatically updated. We find much less, but still found at least some information that allowed us to relate the bile salts to the percent fat. So when you change the percent fat, the bile salts will be adjusted. Here is at least one of the validation cases. It is a compound that we modeled as part of one of our consulting projects. That's why the y-axis is a little bit nondescript, because we cannot really disclose what it is. It was a class 2 compound with lower solubility. It had some food effect. The axes are the same. The scale on y-axis is the same across all of these plots. This was for fasted condition. When they administered the compound with the high-fat meal, the exposure increased a little bit, and you can see that with our previous standard fat physiology, we were slightly under predicting, especially around the Cmax. Now, when we select the default FDA standard breakfast with the zero-order gastric emptying, the model actually nicely captures and predicts the fat condition based on the model built for the fasted condition. So those are the main aspects, main modifications for the ICAD model for the intestinal physiology.
Vera, maybe we could at this point put forward a question.
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, let's see if it works. There we go. We'll leave this up for a brief period of time, but we'd be very interested in hearing from you. What version of GastroPlus are you currently using? Please select one, and numbers are coming in very rapidly. Thank you. Okay, thank you very much for paying attention to this point. Thank you. Vera?
Thanks, Dan. It's actually interesting to see that some of you voted for version 9.4. I don't think we had version 9.4, but I'll count that as a misclick.
That's my fault, Vera. I don't know how to count.
That's okay. So moving on, there have been quite a few developments on the PBPK side. One of the big new improvements, new modifications is we've added model for pregnancy. And this is where we split it up into two different models for the first 6 weeks of gestation, where the fetus is very small, doesn't really have a heartbeat yet. We've modified the physiology by adding just the uterus compartment, so that you can at least start looking at the distribution of the compound into the uterus. There isn't much else going on within those first 6 weeks. But for gestational age, after 6 weeks, we do have a description for the fetus compartment as well. Fetal compartment, amniotic fluid, placenta is included. as well as the mechanisms for the drug exchange, for the intramembranous pathway for drug exchange between amniotic fluid and the fetal blood flow as it's happening within fetus, within placenta, for transmembranous pathway for drug exchange between amniotic fluid and uterus, and of course for the additional effects that are happening in the fetus compartment, swallowing, secretion, urination, and the drug exchange due to those processes. In this version, we are implementing this more simplified model where the fetus is represented by a single compartment. The plan is in the future versions to extend this into a more detailed PBPK model for the fetus, especially, which would be relevant, especially at the later stages of the pregnancy, maybe for the last trimester, to add the actual tissues. But for now, it is modeled as a single fetal compartment. When it comes to creating these physiologies, it is as simple as creating any other physiology in our per module. When you set your physiology to female, under health status, you will have an option to select pregnant female. And then the required inputs are what you had to define previously. Age of this female, gestational age, and based on these basic inputs, the program will create the default physiology, specifying what should be the weight of the fetus, cardiac output for that fetus, what would be the total body weight for, or what would be the baseline body weight for the pregnant woman before the pregnancy, and so on. Of course, you do have an option to modify these parameters. So the program comes up with the defaults, but again, you can make the modifications to the fetus compartments as well. And just like what we've discussed with the previous, on the previous slide, for the very early pregnancy up to 6 weeks, we will only add the additional uterus compartment. For the later pregnancy after 6 weeks, you will have the uterus as well as the placenta, fetal compartment, amniotic fluid, and so on. It is linked to the population simulation as well. So if you want to do a population simulation with the pregnancy model, you have an option to account for variability in both maternal physiology, so define the age range for the mother, body weight range, or BMIs, and define the variability in the fetus compartment as well. Here, the only restriction is that you will have to split it up into those two basic groups, either looking at the gestational age between 0 and 6 weeks for the very early pregnancy, and or the gestational age between 6 weeks and 40 weeks birth to account for the later stages of the pregnancy. And the body weight that program describes here, you will see the weight gain for the mother, the total body weight, and the final BMI that would account for the total body weight based on the gestational age. This is one of the validation examples. We've gone through several of them. This is one, I'll go only through one in this presentation, for cefazolin, which is being used for antibacterial prophylaxis. It is excreted or eliminated entirely in urine. And for elimination, it is a combination of simple glomerular filtration, where we would use GFR, FUP times GFR, but there is also a contribution of the transporters as for active secretion of this compound. So our model building was the standard procedure, starting to build the model with adults, non-pregnant. Actually, the data that we obtained was from healthy males. And you can see the baseline model with calibrated active renal secretion, nicely accounted for the PK of cefazolin going from 0.5 up to 4 grams IV injection. So taking this model, we then used it to start predicting what would be happening in pregnant females, as well as in some of the fetus compartments, at least as much as data was available. So taking the same model, simply replacing physiology to represent a pregnant woman, we were able to nicely model different studies. From this first study that I'm showing here, they did not do any measurements in amniotic fluid or fetal compartments. They only measured the plasma in the mother, plasma concentrations in the mother, and you can see that the PK of cefazolin was nicely captured in these women. These were at right before birth. All of these data was before undergoing cesarean delivery, so it was a full-term delivery in this case. In the second study, they measured both plasma concentration in the mother as well as in the neonate or newborn right after birth. And you can see again the model nicely captured the PK in the mother as well as in the fetus itself, or in the newborn at this point. There is quite a bit of variability. You can see there were a couple of concentration points, the observed concentration points up here, but the model nicely predicted and matched the majority of the observed data. These are additional two studies where they measured, in the study they measured the plasma concentrations in the mother, in the fetus or in the newborn, as well as in the amniotic fluid on the very last point. So for the top set of plots, this was studied before undergoing cesarean delivery. So we were looking at about 39 weeks gestational age, full term, and you can see the model nicely predicted the PK in the mother as well as in fetus and in amniotic fluid. Well, given large variability in the data, especially in the fetus here. The second study was intramuscular injection, and this was before undergoing hysterectomy. It was only in pregnant women, and it was on average only about 14 weeks of gestation. The maternal PK was captured very nicely. We start seeing a little bit of mismatch here on the fetus PK, and we do have a mismatch here on the amniotic fluid concentrations. We are still trying to figure out whether it has something to do with the intramuscular delivery or with the early stage of pregnancy. The other thing is there is also a big difference between the concentrations measured in the early time points versus the late time points. So not completely sure yet what's causing for the mismatch. After several hours, the compound should be gone from the system by then. But overall, the predictions are working fairly well. And again, all of these predictions in the pregnancy are done by simply replacing physiology without making any additional changes to the model parameters. The other modification that we've done was more general to PBPK modeling, where we finally added the lysosomal compartment to one of our KP methods. We've extended only the default KP method. Didn't do this extension for every one of those, but for the default, we've added the lysosomal compartment. And there are two effects. One is drug partitioning into the water in the lysosomal compartment, where due to difference in pH, the ionization will cause different accumulation, especially for the basic compounds. So we'll have more accumulation in the lysosomal compartment. And the other effect is also different binding to acidic phospholipids. Again, mainly for the basic compounds, these will be more ionized, so the concentration of positively charged species will be higher, and the overall binding to the acidic phospholipids will be higher. Now, we did not have exact information on the concentration of acidic phospholipids in the lysosomal membrane versus other cell membranes, so we are assuming that it is distributed evenly, and we are splitting it by the fraction of lysosomal volume to assign how much of that acidic phospholipid would be related to lysosomes, and the rest of it is related to the remaining of the cell. One critical aspect was characterizing the new parameters. So in order to incorporate it, there are two tissue-specific parameters that are critical. One is the fraction of lysosomes in each tissue. The other one is pH in the lysosomal compartment. About 2 years ago, publication by Asmus, some of you might be familiar with this one already. They've done a lot of work, so on trying to collect this information. They managed to find information on the lysosomal volume fractions and pH in liver, in lung, and partial information in kidney. This was more estimated parameters from the other tissues. But based on the information in liver compartment, in lung compartment, and from the liver tissue, we used the fat storing cells, or the information for fat storing cells, to approximate the conditions in the adipose tissue. And based on those three experimental points, you can see there was a rough relationship between the lysosomal volume fraction and the concentration of acidic phospholipids. We used this linear interpolation to calculate or estimate what would be the lysosomal volume fraction in the remaining tissues. So the blue points here are those three experimental points. The red triangles are calculated concentrations or lysosomal fractions in all the other tissues. So this way we have all the tissues combined. We don't have to make a decision in which tissues we'll account for it, in which tissues we won't. This high point here actually represents the kidney tissue, and you can see that this model, the extrapolation based on acidic phospholipids, actually gave us a value that is close to the value that they estimated for the kidney tissue. So yeah, it seems to be working reasonably well. Here is for the implementation. So for each of the tissues, you will see the additional specification for the lysosomal volume fraction and for the lysosomal pH. For lysosomal pH, we have the actual values only for the two tissues, for the liver and lung, which are different. For all the other tissues, you would see the lysosomal pH set to 5.1. But again, you have an option to explore the different effects. You have access to that parameter, so you will be able to change that pH and explore what might be happening. In terms of the settings, you have the new KP method for incorporating the lysosomes, as well as for permeability limited tissues. You will have new method for intracellular binding that would account for the partitioning into the lysosomes as well. A little bit of validation here. What you are seeing here are the KPs calculated versus observed for the different tissues that we have in PBPK model, and the observed data here came from the two Rogers publications. So this lumps the data for all the compounds, acids, bases, weak bases, strong bases, and so on. And the last two plots are showing the volume of distribution from Poulan publication. So the data points on the KP plots are not necessarily for the same compounds as for the volume of distribution plots. The orange circles on each of those plots is showing our default KP method or predictions using our default KP method without the lysosomes. The blue circles are showing the KPs with the lysosomes. As you would expect, the biggest differences you will see in the kidney, liver, and lung tissues where the lysosomal contents are the highest. So it shifted the KPs a little bit further up in those tissues. But there are some small changes in few of the other tissues as well, which would have still significant contribution of the lysosomes. Similar on the volume of distribution, you would see shift, especially for the basic compounds. The volume of distribution predictions go a little bit higher up.
Do you think we could hit him with another poll question at this point?
Sure.
Okay, very quickly. Which of the following agencies, if any, have asked for models as part of your regulatory submission packages? And if you are a regulatory agency, I presume you will not answer this, but select all those that are appropriate. And do feel free to ask your questions. You have the question panel. We will get to those at the end, and we are seeing a good, healthy response for questions. So Vera will need a few minutes at the end for sure to answer some of those. And thank you for your time on this poll.
Okay, thank you, Dan. That was just a subtle reminder that I need to speed this up. So for the lysosomal trapping, this was the calculations of the KP's volume of distribution. One more validation example. Those of you who have dealt with the lysosomal trapping might have seen this publication a couple of years ago on the dizipramine, which is a strong lipophilic base, potential for lysosomal trapping and its effect on volume of distribution as well as on the absorption. And in this publication, we applied the strategy that we would typically recommend in the past is for these types of compounds, increase the blood to plasma ratio to calculate the volume of distribution to account for that lysosomal trapping. So on the right plot, you see what was the calculation with just the default method with the predicted in silico blood to plasma ratio. On the left-hand side was we increased it and were able to match the volume of distribution. So the point of adding the lysosomal trapping directly to the KP method is so that you don't have to do this artificial increase in the blood to plasma ratio anymore. This is showing the same simulations with one more change since they in the time between when the paper was published and now I actually managed to find the experimental value for blood to plasma ratio for the dizipramine. So the top plots are showing what the experimental blood to plasma ratios would predict. And the top plots are showing the default method without the lysosomes. And we still have, even though we have the experimental BP ratio now, we still have a mismatch on the volume of distribution. The new method with the lysosomes is bringing it much closer to the observed data. It's still not perfect. We have a little bit of mismatch for this compound here for the female physiologies, but it did bring it much closer, and the mismatch is much lower than in the if we don't account for the lysosomal trapping. The other modification that we've made was we finally allow mixing the tissue types for different compounds in the simulation. Right? One scenario that you might have seen quite frequently in the past, if you needed to model metabolites, if the metabolites were more polar than the parent compound, frequently you would have a parent compound that was nicely matched with the default or simpler perfusion-limited tissues. Right? But going into the metabolite, because of its polar nature, it would require a permeability limitation. Okay? And if you started the model development by starting with the parent compound, sorting out how that model and then linking the metabolite, very frequently you would end up with something like this because your metabolite would be using the perfusion limited tissues as well. Right? And at this point you had a choice, either live with a bit of a mismatch on the appearance phase for the metabolite, right? Or change also the parent compound model into permeability limited model with high PSTC values just to approximate the perfusion limited model that you actually needed. So you will not have to live with these approximations or modify the model for every different scenarios. You can now mix and match the tissues, so you can have a parent with perfusion limited tissues, metabolite with permeability limited tissues, or the other way around, having any mix of the tissue types. The other area where this becomes very useful is in DDI simulations. Right? Again, up until now, if you were doing the DDI predictions, you had to make sure that you have the model calibrated for your victim as well as for the perpetrator with the exact same tissue types. you won't have to do that anymore. The program will be able to cross this over, so you don't have to make modifications to the model. For the metabolism and transporter, staying a little bit longer on the PK side, we've looked more at the polymorphic expressions of the enzymes now, and we have these 4 different enzymes that are known for the polymorphic expression or for the extensive poor metabolizer phenotypes. So we've done a lot of research collecting all the information we were able to find in the literature, and expanded the expression levels in the physiologies to include the extensive, intermediate, and poor metabolizer, or expression levels that would represent the activities of the enzymes for extensive, intermediate, and poor metabolizers. For each of these enzymes, you will still have that generic expression level accounting sort of for a general overall activity, but you will also have the additional activities or expression levels representing the other activities. So in the physiology, you will have all of these different scenarios included, and it will be up to you to define for any specific simulation or any specific record what type of combination of activities for these enzymes you want to include for a given simulation. Of course, you need to make sure that for given enzyme, for a single enzyme, you pick only one of these phenotypes. You cannot have the same subject be extensive as well as poor metabolizer of the same enzyme. It has been added to the population simulation. So if you have a record where you defined a specific phenotype for one of these enzymes, when you are setting up the population simulation, you will have an option to define the phenotype frequency for that enzyme. The default values are what we found as typical distribution of ultra-rapid, extensive, intermediate, poor metabolizers within given population, either American or Asian population. But of course, you have an option to modify these distributions or these different phenotype fractions. The program in the output file from the population simulation, you will have the exact information for each subject, whether it was modeled as extensive, intermediate, poor metabolizer, and so on, if you are doing the mixture of different phenotypes. If you decide that you want to look specifically at one phenotype, let's say I want to look only at the poor metabolizer, it's very easy. Simply set the poor metabolizer fraction to 1, the rest of them to 0, and all of your virtual subjects will be created as poor metabolizers for that enzyme. For the DDI module, I'm not going to spend much time on this one, just a listing of few new models that are coming up with this version. We've added alfentanil as additional CYP3A4 probe substrate, efavirenz as a moderate CYP3A4 inducer. You already have rifampicin as a strong inducer. Now you will have the efavirenz as a moderate inducer. Adding voriconazole as CYP3A inhibitor, and now we are finally adding some transporter models, digoxin as a PGP substrate, erythromycin as PGP inhibitor. This now became much simpler since we don't have to change the tissue types. We can easily distribute these models, and we don't have to give special instructions to everyone how to use them. We've made addition to the PD module as well, added new precursor-dependent indirect models. This would account for scenarios where the drug exhibits indirect PD response, which can describe either tolerance or a rebound in the effect due to either inhibition or a stimulation or some endogenous mediator or a precursor of the in the body. So let's say if administration of the compound or if creates or causes depletion or stimulation or another compound that affects the response, you will be now able to account for these effects. So we've added the 4 new indirect models the class 5 and 6 that account for inhibition or stimulation of the response production, 7 and 8 accounting for the inhibition or stimulation of the precursor production. And this is an example of prednisolone effect on the T lymphocyte cell counts, showing the initial inhibition followed by a rebound, so the concentration actually goes up as the drug is being removed from the system. And again, you can account for the circadian rhythm in these precursor synthesis rates. So all of these are included. We've done some modifications on the additional dosage routes for a couple of them specifically. One was for transdermal administration. We've added option for evaporation of the compound itself, for evaporation of the drug. Right? For those of you who have worked with the transdermal model, you know that even in the past, we already had an option for evaporation of the solvent. So the solvent or the vehicle in which you are administering the compound on the surface of the skin could be evaporating, changing the concentration gradients and affecting how the drug is being actually pushed into the skin. But lately we've had also cases where the compound itself was volatile and could evaporate from the surface of the skin before it got absorbed. So we've now extended the model so you can account for the evaporation of the compound as well. And this is showing just some of the example or sample simulation. On the left, it's showing the simulated concentrations of dissolved drug in the vehicle, in the stratum corneum, viable epidermis, and dermis. If we don't account for any evaporation, either compound or vehicle. And on the right, just changing some of the sample scenarios. If we account for slow compound evaporation, right? If the evaporation is slower than dissolution, we'll go through this little maximum in the vehicle concentration, and that actually affects how the drug is getting into the stratum corneum and the other skin layers. If we speed up compound evaporation, that it becomes about the same rate as the dissolution. The shapes of the profiles will be similar to no evaporation, but everything will be lower because we are losing the compound quite quickly from the surface of the skin. And again, if we add the vehicle evaporation to it, the concentration gradients change again, creating different shapes of the profiles. So both of these may be important in terms of capturing or predicting the compound concentrations, either in skin or how the compound would proceed further into systemic circulation from the dermis compartment. For the intramuscular model, we've added the account for or possibility to account for the immune cell or immune response after the injection. This is something that we became very aware of as we were working on the long-acting injectable project over the last couple of years. And we've realized that the immune cell layer or immune response could be affecting the drug, how the drug proceeds into the systemic circulation, and the apparent in vivo release of the compound. So we've added an option to create this immune cell layer that is being formed after injection around the depot compartment, right, around the injected formulation. So as the drug maybe easier to see in the schematics here. As the drug is then dissolving in the depot compartment, it first has to diffuse through this additional cell layer before it can move into the systemic circulation. And this immune cell layer is a dynamic compartment. The thickness grows initially and eventually it goes away. So based on some information that we were able to again find in the literature, on how the surface area of this cell layer is changing, how the volume of the infiltrated cell layers are changing, we were able to come up with a function to describe the actual changes in the thickness of that cell layer. So with the intramuscular injection, you will now have additional tab where you can select to include the immune response in the model, where the compound needs to first diffuse through that additional cell layer. And here the diffusion will be dependent on the diffusion coefficient through that cell layer and the percent unbound or possible binding in those cells. And you have two more options. One is a simple model assuming that the thickness of this cell layer stays constant, or account for the actual dynamics of that cell layer and for the formation, how it's increasing in thickness first, and over time how it's going down and disappearing within about a week. These are just some sample simulations. All of them were done with a simple zero-order release of the compound from the formulation over 100 hours. And if we don't include this cell layer, this additional cell layer, this additional barrier to the compound getting into systemic circulation, the plasma concentrations are, as you would expect, reach equilibrium, and once the release of the compound stops at the 100 hours, we'll be just looking at the clearance of the compound from the system. If we include a constant ICL layer, and I have it here at the about 1 millimeter thickness for that cell layer, we will see change in the plasma concentration, initially slower appearance of the compound in the systemic circulation, and after the release is complete, slower apparent clearance of the compound from the systemic circulation, because there is still a lot of compound in that immune cell layer which formed the little depot, and the compound is still being released. And finally, this is what the same simulation would look like with the variable thickness, and the green line is showing the thickness of the cell layer that I simulated for about 2 days. It reaches maximum in about 2 days, and then slowly starts dissipating, disappearing, and within about a week, the immune cell layer is gone. And again, how it would affect the simulated plasma concentration using the same exact release from the formulation itself. So you can see, if you only see the plasma concentrations and try to do the deconvolution of the apparent in vivo release, you can imagine each of these would give you very different in vivo release, even though the changes in the plasma concentrations in this case are really not caused by the release of the drug from the formulation, but they are caused simply by the differences in the immune response or in the response of the body to the injection itself. Couple of additional features. There have been few other small features that we've added in convenience modifications, but a couple of them that I wanted to highlight, because again, these are something that have been requested for quite some time now. One is we are finally giving you flexibility in fitting the solubility versus pH model. Okay? I'm sure many of you are familiar with the feature. If you have measured solubilities of your compound at several different pH conditions, you have an option to calibrate the model to match the solubility versus pH profile, to use that model then in the simulation. Okay? And we've had for quite some time a simple feature to fit the model, but in the past the program would decide for you which parameters would be adjusted. So it would typically adjust both pKa as well as the solubility factor to get the closest match to the observed data. Now, oftentimes you have measured pKa's, or at least some of the pKa's, and you really want to fit only the solubility factors, or fit the solubility factors and the pK that you didn't measure, the pK where you have more uncertainty. So if you wanted to do that in the past, you would have to do it by manually modifying the parameters here. Now we've extended this feature where you can select and tell the program exactly which parameters you want to fit and which parameters you want to keep constant, because you have actually measured them. So you will have more flexibility and can get easier match to the observed data. And for the PEF converter, again, some of you are utilizing this feature quite a bit to build the correlation between your in vitro permeability assays and the human jejunal permeabilities, right? In the past, these human jejunal permeabilities were always hidden in the program, right? Finally, we are showing you what human jejunal permeabilities the program is using to create those correlations. And you can see here there is a column on the right as well to show where each of that permeability values came from, in which publication you can see that that parameter value. I think that's the, before we wrap up this presentation, I need to point out that, I did have the pleasure of delivering all of these different exciting developments, but I actually personally had very little to do with implementing them. Majority of that work was really done by our SimTech team and with the help from some other teams, consulting studies, helped with some of the new models in the DDI, cheminformatics group, of course, helping with the new predictions for the unmet predictor models and so on. But majority of the work that I was presenting here was really done by Jim, Haim, Kay, Jessica, Azar, and Maxime, helping out with, again, some of the validation work, especially on the pregnancy model and so on. So then maybe this would be a good time for your last question.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. And we'll get to the questions that have been asked of us momentarily, but we would very much like to know the use status of GastroPlus within your organization. So if you could just select in the next 20 seconds or so, whether you're currently using, would like to evaluate, or not using. And then we'll move on to your questions. Also, if you should not be able to ask a question at this time, do feel free to ask afterwards. Send us an email and we'll do our best to respond as quickly as we can. So again, thank you for the voting. I will close it now and we'll jump to your questions. Give me a minute to get there. All right, first question, is it possible to extend GastroPlus functionalities from pharmaceutical compounds to nutraceutical compounds?
GastroPlus can be used for just about any compound. It has been used for with chemical industry. It has been used with cosmetics. So it does not necessarily have to be just a specific drugs or pharmaceuticals. It can be any type of compound that you can characterize, right? Of course, it comes down to being able to provide the inputs for these mechanistic simulations, depending on what is the exposure route, what would be so the program can account for dissolution, absorption of the compound, elimination, and so on. But beyond that, it's not really specific to just the pharmaceutical compounds.
Okay, great, thank you. We have two questions that are asking about the same thing. I'll say them both simultaneously and we'll see if I actually can say that. Is the pregnancy PBPK model extended to other species except human? And the second question was, will you implement a rat pregnancy model?
So at this point, for version 9.7, it is parameterized only for human. The plan is to expand it to the animals in the future as well, and that would include rat. So the workings and the equations are there. It is not enabled for the animal species currently because we don't have the physiological parameters that we need to research. So we do need a little bit more time doing the literature search for the physiological parameters for the animal species. It is planned for the future, but in version 9.7, it's for human only.
And a follow on to that as well, are we looking at cow, sheep, or chicken physiology implementing into a PBPK modeling?
Yeah, that is a question that comes up every now and then. We haven't looked into all of these other animal species yet. It really is our improvements or incorporations of additional physiologies. It's all driven by how much demand there is. So as the demands for these additional species start increasing, I'm sure at some point we'll get there. We just haven't managed to collect the information for those types of animals.
Okie dokie, thank you. Next question is, does the new lysosomal trapping model improve the overall prediction of volume of distributed steady state, volume of distribution? It seemed to make it worse on the shown graphs, was the observation.
Yeah, actually, it didn't really make it worse. It's just the way it was displayed, because I lumped all of the different compounds. So for some compounds, it didn't actually make it better, and it make the plot look bad. It does improve it for the compounds where the lysosomal trapping is a significant effect. Things like strong lipophilic bases, right? So for those, it did move it usually closer. There are still some outliers. These were acid compounds, and we need to figure out what is causing that they have a higher volume of distribution than what we are predicting. Some of these compounds where it was already bad and it got actually worse are related more to moderate bases, and a lot of it is going to be dependent on parameterization of the blood to plasma ratio, right? So some of these, that may appear to get worse might be because of the assumptions on the properties of the compound. In general, it does definitely make it better for the compounds where the lysosomal trapping is significant and is expected to be significant. The strong lipophilic bases, and again, that's one of the reasons why we are making this at the moment more of an optional method. The default is staying still the method that we had in the past, but the one with lysosomes is an optional method that you have that you can use, and it would be recommended to be used especially with the strong lipophilic bases where the lysosomal trapping is expected to be a significant effect.
I think it demonstrates people are paying attention to your presentation, Vera. So that's good. The follow-on question was, did the new fed state models also change the blood flows depending on meal type?
No, that is a very good question. We have not created a link to the blood flow yet. We do. I know this is a recurring question that has been there for some time. It is something that we definitely need to account for in the version 10, but in this version, it's not automatically changing the blood flow. So when it comes to blood flow, you still have to do that manually. The new fed models were really focused more on the intestinal effects themselves in terms of the gastric emptying and the bile salt concentrations.
Okie doke, with 3 minutes left, we'll try to get to the remaining questions. For the pregnancy model, which routes of exposure are available? And can the model be applied to environmental chemicals?
It is a general PBPK model, so any routes of exposure that you can currently use without PBPK models, you can use with the pregnancy model. As you might have noticed, we already had this one of these validation cases for intramuscular administration. It really is not dependent on the administration routes. Anything that you can do with current PBPK model, you can do with the pregnancy model. And in those terms, of course, the environmental chemicals can be covered. It all comes down to how well you can parameterize all of the, the different absorption and elimination parameters for the chemical of interest.
Okay, here's a general question. When you run a simulation and click the amount dissolved, what does the graph represent? Amount dissolved in all 9 compartments of ACAP model or a specific compartment?
Okay, I think I have GastroPlus somewhere in here. Let me see if I can bring it up. Just wanted to make sure that everybody can see it. Okay, my screen is not cooperating.
We could always get back. We have the name. So
yeah, there it is. So just to make sure that everybody knows what this question was about, when you click the dissolved amount, means this red curve on the absorption dissolution plot, it is showing the cumulative amount dissolved. Right? So it actually includes or lumps the compound that is still in the dissolved state in any of the intestinal compartments, also the compound that was dissolved and already got absorbed. Okay? So this is the cumulative dissolution, the compound that was ever dissolved and did not precipitate. That's what that curve accounts for. If you want to see the amounts dissolved, the actual time-dependent amounts dissolved in different compartments, you do have an option to plot them as individual amounts dissolved, and then you can see the movement of the compound and see the amount dissolved in individual compartments.
Okay, thank you. And based on time, this will be the last question. Does the pregnancy model consider the increase or reduction of enzyme expression, or do we have to change that expression manually?
I think there are some enzymes for which we had the information. So if we were able to find the information as to how they are changing, right, then it is incorporated. For others, if we did not have information, you have to do it manually. And again, we do give you information about which ones were changed when you create the physiology and you look at the enzyme expression levels or transporter expression levels, right? The source does tell you if it says it was pregnant, it means it was scaled for the pregnancy based on what we were able to find in the literature. If it's just showing adult healthy, it means it was just for a non-pregnant adults and it does not account for the pregnancy.
All right, well, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Right. Thank you very much, Viera, and thank you to everyone that attended and asked questions. If you do have remaining questions, we would invite you to send them to us directly. Again, this session is being recorded and will be available on our website. Thank you again, and this concludes today's webinar. Have a great day.